All right, we're back in our scene. And just to reiterate where we are, if I jump back into this fuse graph, we can see that we have this relatively simple setup with our eye look rig. And we have, well, we should have some blending in there, but if we jump back over to our main rig, we can see that we have the exact same rig all set. Okay. So everything's working. But when we want to actually output this to the rig builder, right? So the goal here is to create this graph, this little rig, as a component that we can use within the asset browser or the component catalog within the rig builder, right? That's our goal. So one quick way to check and make sure that everything is working is to plug all of this into another AutoRig component. And say no. This is going to go into the second input. Okay, so we'll say use second input. Oh, wrong connection. I have to use this output here. And there we go. So if I hit enter, we can see that our rig is still working. What we're making sure of when we do this process is that when our rig is plugged into a second input into an AutoRig component, that it's still updating properly. Okay. So this is a great way to check and make sure that when we actually do create our AutoRig component, right, the rig builder component, that it should work. And in this case, it is working. So let's jump out of this. We can delete this AutoRig component. We don't need it anymore. So let's go to this fuse graph node, and I'm going to go to the rig builder tab here. I'm going to turn on use with rig builder, and now all of the previously grayed out options here are, now we have access to everything here. So within this rig builder type, we have several different options, okay? But we're just going to stick with skeleton at this point because we just want to basically grab our skeleton, right? Within the joint group down here, we want to be able to grab a certain joint and use that as our component, right? These other options are more relevant when you're using more complex workflows that typically involve a fair amount of Apex scripting. When you're creating a more complex component and you need, for instance, configuration controls, you'll need to use a fair amount of Apex script in order to do that. The fuse graph is a fairly simple component where it just takes in whatever rig graph that you made and just plugs it into your rig. Okay. So it's lacking in terms of customization, but one good way to think about it is that all the customization that you want is happening within your actual custom graph that you made. So considering all this, let's go ahead and move forward. We'll jump into the actual animation state here. And I'm going to grab a joint. Okay, so we're going to use from the guide skeleton. I'm going to grab this eyeball joint right here because that's the joint that we're affecting with our custom rig. And I'll just hit enter. Okay, so now we have our eyeball joint in there. I'm going to delete this side indicator because we're not using that. And with all that done, I'm going to go to the actual save tab. And here is where we actually set up the name, the labeling, right? This is where it's actually going to show up as within the component catalog. The component icon, right? So if you guys create a custom icon for your component, that's where you'd set that up there. And within the component categories, right? So you can actually give this a certain kind of category. So for the namespace, I'm going to use Max Rose, right, for my name. I'm going to call this iBot rig. Or rather, let's call this iLook rig. this is going to be version 1. Okay, we're going to call this iLook rig, and that's how it's going to show up on the component catalog. Okay, for the component icon, I'm going to select this iRig icon that I made before. And the component categories, we're going to place this under the custom category. Now, when you're saving this out, the default option is to save it within your HIP directory, right? So this would be saving it within your project directory. A better place to actually save this is in the home directory, okay? Because when you save it to the home directory, the rig builder will look at the home directory and fill out the actual component catalog based on all of the components that live in your Houdini folder and in the documents folder, right? So if you have several different projects, right, with all their own rig components, and you need to actually go and reset the auto rig builder, typically what you have to do, well, to reset the auto rig builder, you need to delete all of these custom components, right? To reset it, to get it back to its default state. So if you do need to reset it, you'd have to go to all these other projects and find all the components that you've made before. So it's good to just keep everything into a single location. That makes it easy to find. So it makes it much easier to reset the auto rig builder if need be. I'm going to middle click this and just make sure that the directory is correct. But in this case, it's not. It's going to documents and it's missing the Houdini directory. So I'm going to go and just manually add the Houdini 21.0 folder. So now when I save this, it'll save it into the Apex component folder. And I'm going to call this the ibot look rig 01. And I'll go ahead and save this. So now that we have that saved out, let's jump into the AutoRig builder and hover over the viewport and press enter. Okay, so now we're back in the state and we can see our iLook rig in our component catalog. That's great. So we've created our component, our custom component, and now it's sitting in the component catalog with its icon. So now we need to drag this onto the node, or rather the joint that needs to be affected, okay? So we're gonna look for the eyeball joint. I'm gonna grab this and just drag it right on. Press OK. Okay, zoom back out and we can see that we now have our iLook control. So we've just created our first custom component. It's pretty nice. So now everything is happening within the AutoRig builder. So this is another way that you can take a prototype, right, and apply it to your rig. And at the same time, create a reusable rig component. So let's jump out of this. And down here is where I was actually doing this manually and just using the fuse graph again. So we can take this. I'm not going to delete it. I'm just going to pull it over to the side. And we have our clean here, which is getting rid of the wrist and the iris scale from before. So while we're here, why don't we go and make a couple of corrections to our abstract control, right? Because if we remember, if I move these around a little bit, we can remember that we're overshooting the amount of our blend, right? And we don't want that. So I'm going to put down a configure control, Apex configure controls. Let's jump out of that. And let's jump into here. And the control that we want is this, the iLook abstract blend. And this should be at the bottom here. Right, here it is. iLook abstract blend. We'll select that. And we're going to go to use limits. We're going to create a new parameter limit And the param name that we want is the X, right? Because if you remember, the X is the channel that we promoted when we created our rig. So I'm going to go to the min lock and min or max lock, right? The min and max lock. And I also need to make sure that this is a float value, not a vector3. So we have a float. Let's turn these back on. And I'm just going to set the max lock to 1. So now if I mess with this, you can see that we are locked between 0 and 1. All right. So now if we test this out, let's see. If I move this around and then move the head around, we should be getting a blend. Great. So now we have our eye staring at the specific spot. And if I move my head, now we have the eye following along. Super cool. So our rig is ready to go. In the next video, why don't we go ahead and turn this into a reusable HDA that you can drop into any project, right? So you'll have access to your character as you do with, say, Electra. Okay. So why don't we go ahead and figure out how to set that up?